Well, thank you all for coming. Here today to talk about our debate on Brexit's effect on the southwest construction industry. My name is Josh Hackett. I'm the chair of CIBSE. We're doing this event today with property. I'd like to just put a little background in. Today the debate is not to talk about why you chose to leave the EU or perhaps any party affiliation you might have. The idea today is just to talk about what happens. I know everyone here has some questions. We've been receiving them over the last few days. So we were going to put those to our panel of expert judges who will hopefully be able to put your fears aside or to scare you to high heaven. We don't know. We'll find out soon. But for further ado, I'll pass you over to Peter, who will be hosting the event this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, welcome to ARUP. Yeah, I should probably do the housekeeping first. So we're not expecting a fire alarm. If you hear the fire alarm or something that sounds vaguely like a fire alarm go off, run after me, because I'll be exiting through that door there. You guys at the back can actually go through the back there as well, so hopefully we won't have to practice that. Yeah, Brexit. There's been an awful lot in the press about Brexit. Part of this role, I thought I'd do a bit of research, and there was a few interesting quotes which I just want to share with you. For example, a house builder says, in a post-Brexit landscape where immigration is uncertain and we near triggering Article 50, it is more important than ever to both attract and retain an effective workforce. So Brexit and our workforce. A project manager said, the response by the government to the EU referendum result, not easy for me to say, failed to soothe nerves and calm matters. Prime Minister May's Brexit means Brexit catchphrase has not proved popular or illuminating for those of us trying to plan for the future. Maybe one more. An architect, interestingly, said, UK 2008 Climate Change Act makes carbon cuts legally binding, but there is a risk that this could be repealed by a pro-Brexit government if no longer part of the EU in order to reduce business costs. So an interesting wide range of maybe negative attitudes. Another architect actually took an opposite view. He said, and all of these have come from the Building magazine, I should say, he said recently that even though he's a convinced 48%er, a Remainer, perhaps if we come out of the EU and leave its restrictive policies behind, we can do the Apple in Ireland incentive. There could be tax breaks for Bristol for the aerospace industry, quote unquote. Now, maybe we can make this country a true UK-wide powerhouse. Anyway, all interesting, a wide range of views and opinions. You may have also be aware that Lord Stunnell has been appointed by the House of Lords to undertake a review on the impact of Brexit on the construction industry. Well, good news, he's not here with us today, but we do have 4 panellists who can perhaps give us our views so we don't have to wait for that particular publication. So with no further ado, I will introduce our panellists, and the format is that the panellists will introduce themselves, give a statement on their views. There's about 10 minutes each per panellist, and then at the end of that we will do a question and answer session, and I really hope you will pose some difficult questions for the panellists. If not, I will. So without further ado, Mark, you're first. I think the panellists will introduce themselves, so it's probably easier.
Thank you, Peter. I am the only one in slides. Not surprised as architects like talking about diagrams. So that's me. I am a director at AWW. I've been working here in Bristol and with AWW Architects for 25 years. We cross over with London office, so there's quite a lot of work that we're doing between both Bristol and London. So we're getting a pretty good feel for what's happening both centrally in our main capital and actually what's happening here southwest. And there is a very different kind of thing in terms of two different environments. Just a little bit of a flavour of the kind of work that we've been doing, just to give you a bit of context, really. Narrowkey House, which is a refurbishment, which was standard life, so that was a fund-driven project that was completed quite recently, as was 66 Queen Square, and that's, if you're familiar with Bristol, that's at the end. We did work on the first phase of Princeton Reach, which is quite a large residential scheme, including some commercial, and put Imperial Tobacco into their new building in Winchester. So there's quite a good mixed bag of project types. And then, obviously, things going forward, we're working in Plymouth on a dementia care facility. We're putting a speculative office building up for another fund in Bristol at Glassfield. We work on a residential scheme, Purifier, and one of the largest projects we're doing, which is in association with ARUP, we're working on some of the main civils projects. I think there's a real kind of mixed bag. So we're getting a really good feel for what's happening in the economy, what's happening in the climate, and how that's starting to affect construction. I'm sure all of you know, but normally we actually get a site given to us. It doesn't always happen. Usually then starts with some kind of scribble, which is the fun bit. Ends up being a building. Quite how we get from there to there, still not quite sure. But it involves all of these people, and usually more. I think this was just to demonstrate that this process that we have in construction is highly complex, and it involves a huge number of expert skilled people. I think the skills gap here in this region, and it's probably the same nationally, has been very much supported by the free movement of people, and there's a considerable number of our workforce. I'm sure that applies to a lot of the organisation that actually comes from overseas. And we know that with high levels of immigration, that actually that has increased overall income GDP in the UK. And immigrants have actually made a positive fiscal contribution, paying more in taxes than they've actually received. So clearly there is positive in actually having this real mix within our industry, which we clearly can't do without. And there's a real concern, particularly for us in our industry, if the tap's turned off, and there's currently 10% total construction workforce actually born outside the UK. And those people obviously deliver our houses, our offices, our shops, our leisure facilities. And in order to maintain that, we need to keep supporting these sectors and keep supporting the skills. That's kind of one of the key concerns I think we have in terms of what Brexit is going to do. That's turn that top tap off of these skills. And some of the projects we're working on, like people, are actually highly skilled professionals working. These people have been working within the industry, within the UK for years, actually learn to develop ideas, develop initiatives that make them right at the top of their game in terms of where they are. What we don't need to do is that. Another key concern for us is the impact of inflation and construction costs. Even yesterday I was sat in a meeting where contractors are telling us they're finding it really difficult to fix prices on projects, particularly design and build contracts, where they're being asked to fix price, take risk on some of the packages or some of the work centres not actually going to be letting for possibly 12, 18 months time. How on earth can they predict what that's going to be? There's no certainty on Brexit, and actually inflation sort of bobbling around, but actually predicted to be going up over the next few years. It's putting real pressure on construction costs. We know property investment's actually weakening nationally, and it continues to soften. I think that's probably known in the market. The property budgets, things actually becoming viable, it's becoming more and more difficult with that kind of uncertainty in the weakening investment market. Transaction levels are going to be subdued, and so foreign investors are actually seeing two issues really. One, if you came in at the peak, you're actually trying to make things work, it's really quite difficult because you're seeing all of your gain, your profit actually going away. There are opportunities for those investors who are smart that came in early and bought them cheap. We'll probably hear a bit more about that, but that obviously gives opportunity to actually get some back out. And I think the real issue, and it's the numbers that actually make a difference. 64% of the materials that we use in construction are actually sourced from the UK. So if you think what impact that's going to have on public construction, it could be sort of quite significant. Year on year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think that's also not helped by the fact that the public sector is squeezing all this resources down, and trying to get decisions of local authorities is even proving a bit more difficult. So it's kind of coming in from both sides of it. But you've got construction costs going up, fuels costs going up, and no response from the local government getting budgets to approve. So we're finding things are quite challenging. So is there a solution out there? Can we build things cheaper and be more efficient in our procurement, but obviously try to maintain quality? And that's the hard when you're being squeezed down in terms of budget to maintain that quality. My view is our industry is actually quite archaic in the way it operates, and we have a real opportunity to try to look. And I think the Southwest is really well placed to do this, to really look at ways of doing things smarter, making things, being much more innovative in our approach, much better use of technology, and all of that is supporting things like off-site construction, taking away all of the waste we've got. Our industry is notorious for being very wasteful in the way of things. Actually, by putting stuff into factories, doing it off-site, more sort of just-in-time type processes, we can actually start to limit on that waste. I think we're going to see more and more of that happen, and that's particularly with the weakening of the pound, which means off-site construction from China. That's going to be really attractive. And there's some projects we're looking at with housing, where actually going to go likely to go modular. And those units are going to be built in China and shipped over. That's the cheapest way of doing it, with the way the country is made. So there's quite a lot to think about there. There is still a demand actually in this region particularly for housing. For the first time actually London has dropped out of the top 3 growth regions. So actually we're really well placed, and Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds as well, to pick up some of this opportunity to growth. So there's a real kind of mood of moving away from the London centre. I'd say we've noticed that with the kind of work that we're doing up there. Actually the regions is becoming quite strong in terms of picking up the work. And that's both on commercial and residential. The residential is being driven by just house prices, and the commercial is being driven by central government actually have to go through this specialisation process for some of their departments out. We've got HMRC taking place here with the exploitation process. That's really positive. And I think the way we actually look at designing and developing buildings is changing. We've got a real move away from ownership to rental or shared ownership type of thing. I think that's become more and more important the way we look at developing our communities and our buildings and creating places. It's not the traditional way that I guess we in the UK used to do it. It is a very European model, but PRS is becoming really attractive. Student housing, and then there's a real crossover between what students and what the rental market. So we're starting to see some of these things influence how we're actually designing, how we're developing work. And the leisure sector actually in this region is maintaining a pretty strong start from sort of 2015 onwards, really. Driven by, again, currency weakness, bringing overseas holidaymakers into the UK. The Southwest is really ideally succeeding to that, and sort of find and create great opportunities, beaches, countryside, and locals actually deciding not to go to France holiday, but stay in the UK holiday because of the cost of going abroad. So that market actually has been really strong. We've seen some really good inquiries recently for hotel type of thing. I guess the important things, I think, for everybody in thinking about how we're going to develop our space, our building. It's all about the connectivity. And that's physically through roads, rail, investment in infrastructure is the absolute key. IT, very, very important. The ability to communicate. We're all living in a society now where communication is absolutely key. You've got children, you see all they do is spend their time on the phones with their fingers clicking away, and it's the society that we live in, and I don't think that's really going to change. So that's kind of important. Continued lacking funding in public sector, I think, is going to be quite challenging, and that's putting continued pressure on the impacts of Brexit. So we've got things on kind of all sides making it quite difficult. I think we just need to be smart about how we do things, be a bit more flexible about our approach to design, to make sure that things we are doing can adapt, can be suitable for different kinds of uses, and possibly look at most things a bit more short term. Most of the tenants take very serious risks on the tech or creative industry. They're not prepared to sign up for 50, 20 years each traditional institutions. They're starting to run 5 years break up, really. It's great, but actually that's the kind of occupier that most of the big assets want, because it's not giving them guaranteed income. So we've got to kind of think outside the box in terms of how we're going to do that. Bristol's been really good at that over the last couple of years. Engines have kind of been pushing all of that creative stuff. We need to make sure that we keep providing that kind of space, working with all of the different parts that involved to get that. So that's really important. And I said technology really, in the way we design, we're all, most of you who have worked within large organisations in the industry are probably familiar with BIM and how that actually improves the way you design. And that is going to be forever more important producing.
Right, hello everyone. Let me introduce myself. Wouldn't mind turning the light off, that's great, thank you. I'm David Gascoigne, I'm the Managing Director of Trigon Pensions. We're pension consultants based here in Bristol and not having all the south of the Midlands. Now, you're probably wondering why a pension consultant would want to turn up at a construction industry discussion on Brexit. Having spoken to my fellow panellists here, I have to say I'm thinking pretty much the same thing. I guess the real reason is because I spend an awful lot of my time discussing Brexit, and in particular what Brexit means for the economy. In terms of my role and what I do, well, I spend a lot of time talking about investment markets and investment for the pension fund, and the implications of the macroeconomic position and geopolitical activity upon the underlying investments, and what that means therefore for the companies and the pension fund. And I guess if I look back over the years, sort of 10 years ago, I used to spend my time talking about investment, talking about asset allocation and stocks and things like that. But increasingly, it's become the global economic position which has totally dominated the investment market. And that's been what's been critical in driving markets all the way around the world. And then again, over the last couple of years, things have changed once more, and it's really politics around the world which has started to drive those markets rather than just the economic situation. So Brexit is, of course, key to that, and I found myself discussing this a lot with a lot of clients around the country. Our clients are in all different sectors and spread right around the country. In terms of our clients and what Brexit has meant for them, the answer to that is actually it's been many and varied. For some of them, there has been very little impact at all thus far, because at the moment, we're still in the EU. We haven't triggered Article 50. We certainly don't know what the terms of that are going to be, nor do we know what the trade negotiations are going to result in at the end of that. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So there's very little happened at the moment in terms of their trading position. For other areas, there has been a very immediate impact. Pretty much straight away after the referendum, the companies saw a significant shift. Sometimes it was for the negative, and they've suffered quite badly. In other cases, it's been quite positive, and they've seen a significant upside as a result. So there's been a huge difference in terms of how that is applied. What I need to do, obviously, tonight is just to try and focus very quickly in terms of what I think some of those implications might be for the construction industry, what that might mean. So first, if we just look at the construction industry itself, I mean, the construction industry as a whole contributes about £130 billion a year to the UK economy. That's a significant contribution. It represents about 7% of the overall UK economy. So again, very significant. And in terms of workforce, as Mark was discussing before, It represents, again, around 7% in terms of the overall workforce in the UK. If we look at the self-employed workforce, it's more than double that, so it's very significant. So as a sector, the construction sector is very important in the underlying health of the UK economy. And in terms of what Brexit is going to mean and some of the implications that we see right across all of the sectors, I guess there are probably 5 areas that I just wanted to focus on quickly tonight to talk about how I think that might impact you across the piece, across the country, but then also just to try and deal with that perhaps where I can, where that might impact in terms of the Southwest specifically. The first direct impact and the most significant change we saw as a result of the referendum was the collapse in sterling. That was immediate. It was overnight. If we compare sterling against the dollar being the most stable currency at the time, sterling fell from 150 against the dollar to 130 overnight, a very dramatic movement. It's since moved down again, and it pretty much moves on a daily basis, depending whether Theresa May is saying anything or not. But at the moment, it's dropped down, and following her appearance on Sky at the weekend, it's dropped down to about 121 against the dollar. That's a very sizable movement in the currency position. Now, that has a dramatic impact. Obviously, exports get cheaper, but imports get much more expensive. We're a net importer in the UK, therefore it means we're importing inflation. And as Mark suggested before, we're going to see inflation pick up quite sharply. In truth, whenever you see a rising inflation, and there's a significant change such as that, it generally takes about 2 years for it to feed through. That's because people do forward pricing, there's various other adjustments which have to take place, and generally it takes 2 years before you see the full impact come through, and we expect that to certainly come through during the course of this year, as Mark suggested. At the moment, inflation's already starting to pick up. If we look at CPI, it's up about 1.2%. We're certainly expecting it to pick up and go well through the 2% level this year, certainly probably through 3% later this year. So a very significant uptick. And what that means for you, construction sector, firstly, as Mark suggested there, you're going to see raw material costs go up quite dramatically. And that's going to have a bearing, obviously, as you have to pull those across into compare. And the second aspect, again, as Mark referred to, that rise in inflation is going to lead through across into the labour market as well. There is an upside to sterling's adjustment as well, which you need to be clear on, which is that actually if sterling falls that far, it actually presents a useful opportunity for overseas investors. And it's quite likely we'll see more inward investment into the UK because they can buy a hell of a lot more in the UK now as a consequence. And we've started to see that. The Department of International Trade put out some numbers at the weekend and suggested that a whole number of deals have been done as a result of the referendum, which were going to therefore result in this inward investment. In truth, that was a lot of smoke and mirrors because most of those deals had all been done before the referendum and are now just being signed off. But there are indications that we will now start to see that come through, and we will see some investment where people see there is a real opportunity because of the sterling adjustment. The second point is about the labour market, again, as Mark referred to before, because that's another critical one. And again, some figures I saw in a survey from Willis Towers Watson suggested that 12% of the skilled labour force within the construction sector actually come from within the EU, the EU migrants. And there is definitely a huge demand within your sector for those migrants from within the EU. If that tap gets turned off, to use the phrase that Mark used there, if that gets turned off and you don't have these people coming through, there is going to be a labour shortage in certain areas. So there is likely to be upward pressure again coming into wages, and there's likely to be coming through from the shortage of labour, but also because of the inflation that I referred to before. So there's definitely going to be a consequence there as a result of any changes that take place. We don't know exactly what the new rules are going to be on migration. We're still guessing at this stage as to what it might be. It does appear that Theresa May is taking quite a hard line in that respect. There are quite likely to be some significant rules in place. But even without that, certain individuals from Eastern Europe in particular won't come across to the UK anymore. One, because they might not feel that they're going to be welcome, but secondly, because it's not worth it because of the change in the value of the sterling. So that's a significant adjustment which will take place irrespective. The third area I just want to talk about is the question of growth, because a slowdown in growth will definitely impact all markets and all sectors of the economy. You'll have seen a huge number of figures being put out in terms of the general situation. Just very quickly, we're looking at GDP growth in this last quarter, is probably 2016. It's going to be about 0.5%. That's going to mean we're on track for about 2% in the UK as a whole. That's pretty good, and it puts us pretty much where we expected to have been at the start of the year, and it's pretty much unchanged. What it does mean is nothing has changed after the referendum. We haven't seen the economy get worse very quickly, as some had suggested it might. But that's also because, of course, nothing has changed yet, and it is about to. If we listen to Philip Hammond, the new Chancellor, he suggested in his autumn statement that we'd see the economy shrink quite sharply next year. His suggestion is we'd see it fall down to about 1.4%. There is a huge range of opinion as to how far it is likely to fall, all the way down to pretty much zero, up to a slight growth, up to say 2.5%. But a general consensus would say that actually it is going to be a sharp fall, possibly less than the Chancellor is suggesting, possibly closer to 1%. That's a very sharp decline. And if you think about it, there are two very easy reasons why the economy is going to slow. The first is because companies aren't investing. They don't know what the landscape looks like. They do not know what they're faced with, what the trade situation is going to be. So they're hanging on to their position. They're not putting money into new projects, into infrastructure spends, into new job hires, because they want to wait and see. So the level of business investment has certainly slowed. And then for the economy as a whole, not affecting you so much, but the consumer is also likely to slow their spending during the course of next year. We've seen a number of figures coming out from the retail sector over the course of Christmas. Spending is held up. It's held up over Christmas, but that's it. It's held up, no more than that. And as we go into next year with rising inflation, we're very quickly going to go into a negative real wage inflation situation, and people will stop spending. We've seen that in the announcement to all the retail sector again, that they're very worried about that this year. If that happens, that will slow the economy. So the economy as a whole is likely to slow. Now, within the construction sector, it's notoriously difficult as a sector to gauge what that's going to be, and it has to be said your sector is very volatile. And there's a huge range of opinion there as to how much it's going to slow. But slow, it almost inevitably will. And we're starting to see signs of that already. Again, forecasts would suggest as a whole, maybe we're looking at growth over the next few years falling from 2.5% per annum down to, say, 2% per annum, maybe slightly lower than that. But there's huge regional variation. In London, suggestion it's going to go from around 3.5% down to about 1.5%, so much more dramatic. The good news for you is in the southwest, the suggestions are to be a little bit higher than that, probably between 2.5% and 3% growth. And that's largely because of the level of infrastructure spend which takes place in that area, somewhat protected yet. And that takes me on to the fourth point, which is about infrastructure spend and changing government policy. As a result of Brexit, as you all be well aware, we had a change, not of government, but we had a change of the people within the government. We had a new Prime Minister and various other people coming onto the Cabinet, which changed significantly the economic and policy outlook. In particular, the new Chancellor, obviously replacing George Osborne, out went George Osborne's plan, which was to keep the economy very much under control, particularly in terms of debt, try and get back into a budget surplus by the end of this Parliament. That went out to be replaced by, we need to stimulate the economy. The Bank of England had basically done everything it can do in terms of monetary policy, cutting interest rates to the bone, quantitative easing to try and stimulate the economy. That's now done. There is nowhere else to go. So it's over to government to try and do something on fiscal policy. And in terms of fiscal policy, they could cut taxes. That's not a great route. It's not to bring in the revenue, and we haven't seen any move that way. But the other is to look at infrastructure spending. Now, there are already, as you'll be well aware, a number of significant infrastructure projects out there, such as PPC, Wilfer and things like HS2, things like that, which obviously are significant, but this is about new ones that could potentially come on board. In the autumn statement, the Chancellor obviously announced a new housing infrastructure fund, 2.3 billion, to try and build 100,000 new houses by 2020. He also announced another 1.7 billion for housing would come through with private partnership with companies as well. All of that will help in terms of infrastructure spend. And there are a number of other projects as well, which are likely to be funded as the government tried to stimulate the economy through that spending power instead. It will increase our debt, but it's necessary to try and make sure that we keep the economy on track. And then the fifth one, and probably the most important one of all, but the most general one of all, is the uncertainty. As we started off by saying, we haven't got a clue exactly what is going to happen. because government and the negotiators, frankly, haven't got a clue in terms of what's going to happen, what they're going to do here. And so long as that remains, that uncertainty acts as a constant drag and will continue to be there and continue in place. In your sector, I think it's fair to say, there are many more variables than there have probably ever been for quite some time. That slowdown in the economy, the uncertainty of the labour market, the uncertainty of the raw material costs, etc. A huge number of moving pieces which will dictate how things pan out over the course of the year. And I would just say, if 2016 was the time when we saw this change take place, the Brexit vote happened back in the summer, 2017 will definitely be the time when we finally start to see what the consequences of that will be, whether that's good or bad. Okay, thank you.
What an uplifting negative message. In a bizarre way. Right, I'm Jo Davies. I am the regional senior partner of GDA. We are bizarrely a Bristol-based company. No, sorry, that's not true. I head up the Bristol office, but we're part of a European company. So we've got a dichotomy whereby our governance comes from Germany, and yet we're now sitting in a position where Brexit is moving us out of the EU. So I'm just going to take a slightly separate line to Mark and David, and I want to just talk about kind of three things. So the first thing I want to just kind of cover off is the property sector rather than construction. So kind of the first thing to say about the property construction is most property investors, successful developers, work on a 5-year cycle. So some of them are just going into it, knowing that in 5 years' time we're going to be out of Europe. Some of them are right in the middle of it, so know that whatever happens, they have to complete their deals and they have to let them or sell on that land without development during this transaction. And some of them are are in various sizes. So whatever happens, property's going to carry on, and some of these things are going to carry on in different ways in different fields. What I love about this evening is I'm not going to be wrong in any way, shape or form, because there's not a right answer. So how about that? So let's start to think about that property cycle, and let's start to think about it in terms of the EU programme. So yeah, March is the big day that we're all talking about, and the talk might not be gone until 2019. So in that scenario, quite a lot of these developments will be coming through, and those developers have got to make decisions about what they do. We've already heard that probably the biggest immediate impact was the drop in sterling, and as Davies rightly said, that's having a very big impact in terms of actually the attractiveness of development deals in the UK, because you actually get more for your pound if it's European funding coming in. And we've already seen a shift in terms of investment in the property market, coming away from kind of UK funds and into Asia and into non-EU countries looking to invest their money into the UK property market because it was strong and it had great opportunities. So we've got to keep that in mind, that actually that works well for them. The second thing that we know is that the immediate position is that we've seen an increase in terms of employment in the UK during the end of this period. Now that is going to stop without question, but the challenge comes back to the very conversations we've been having, skill set, delivery, and the speed. That speed of delivery in that 5-year property cycle is really, really important to make sure that you actually get in and out, and those developers get in and out at the right time for the cycle. And then the third thing that kind of then sits out of that, again, which has been touched on, we've seen this in London, is this issue that through the EU is that we're going to lose kind of the passport rights for our financial services. And how does that impact on London? And how does that impact in London on the office market? Because the office market in London has been red hot right the way up until 2016. And if that starts to falter, actually the ability to draw the sort of investment that we're talking about, HMRC, back into our regions is going to be more challenging, because actually it's going to be more attractive to stay in London. So kind of we need to think about all of those factors kind of moving forward. But the immediate impact has been the investment level, and I think the point was really well made that actually saying it's all right now is because those investment deals were done before Brexit announcement. So the figures that I've been quoted in Q3, we were £9.5 billion worth invested in the property market, compared to £14.5 billion over the last 4 quarters prior to Brexit. So there's been an immediate impact. The positives and spikes in terms of the property sector are around distribution. Now that's not about Brexit, that's about the fact that we're shopping in a different way. That's about major Amazon distribution centres and the way that we're doing retail. So, there's things that are going to influence the property market and the construction market that are not really relevant to Brexit at all. And then the second, of course, is the leisure and tourism industry, and that's really, really important because, again, foreign visitors are coming in because they're getting more money for their pounds. So there's a whole host of factors there that are the immediate impact. And at that point, that actually, when we'll be out of Brexit, that those property cycles still have to keep within those five-year cycles. We then look at what it means in terms of planning legislation and legislation generally. And I am not equipped in any way, shape or form compared to the next speaker to talk about these things, no pressure. But I do want to kind of pick up on a couple of things. So one of the biggest factors in terms of construction is the delay in terms of planning. That doesn't change with Brexit, I'm afraid. And in the EU, it's very clear that actually all EU countries are allowed to make their own planning laws. So the pure planning point of view is very much in the control of our government, rightly or wrongly. I think the other key thing to say is that we are not going to, by leaving Europe, have less housing. We're not going to have any difference in terms of climate control changes. We're not going to have any differences between greenhouse gases and biodiversity. Those problems are all still there. They're all still going to be dealt with through the legislation. Every planning application, every construction site is going to have to deal with those. So that doesn't really change a huge amount of things. So then we start to look at, well, what does change and what can change? And the two key pieces of legislation from a pure planning perspective are environmental impact assessments, lots of opportunities to change there. What does that mean? What do those changes happen? And habitat and wildlife, because that's the key word. So does that mean that we're going to stop protecting the horseshoe bat in the same way as we have previously, and you're not going to all start doing huge ecological mitigation measures? Of course it's not, because those species are still endangered. Our issues with regard to greenhouse gases are still huge. So from our perspective, even though we're coming out of Europe, the legislation will still need to be there. What has to be done is get an absolute clarity and ensure there's not a vacuum in between the two while we work through the details of it. So then you have to ask yourself, well, where's the positives? So let's look at the positives. And the positive that everybody tells me is that poor old procurement police, they're not going to have the OJU process to deal with in terms of public sector work, because so that's going to go away and create opportunities for smaller organisations to bid for those kind of big public sector jobs. Well, is that right? I'm not actually really sure it is that right. We will still need to have that level of procurement. We'll still need to be able to demonstrate that things are working on a level playing field. But I think what it does do is it allows the government to look back at how we deal with public and private sector partnerships. We've touched on infrastructure, we've touched on public sector previously, but David made a point with regard to the number of houses that have to be lived on public sector land, the level of investment that's going to go into delivering houses, and how that's going to be coupled between the government's funding coming forward to accelerate housing and the private sector coming forward. So I can see some real opportunities coming forward that will allow us to start to look at those public-private partnerships in a more succinct way, and that's got to be good for construction. There are some positives kind of coming through on this. And then that then takes us to many of the things that we've talked about. So what's been talked about already today is the importance of infrastructure. Infrastructure and infrastructure delivery is going to be critical, absolutely critical, to our continued growth in terms of the property and construction cycle. And we're already seeing slowdowns on some of those, but are those slowdowns because of the UK's fiscal policies, or are those slowdowns simply because of Europe? I suspect it's the first rather than the second. The implications of electrification being delayed can have a much bigger impact in the short term in terms of our region, our sub-region, than anything else. We talked about Hinkley. It's a huge infrastructure project that's going to have a massive positive influence in terms of our region. And again, that we've got to build on the back of that. Although, as Mark rightly pointed out, there are going to be implications that come from that in terms of shortages of supplies and therefore our ability to be able to build things out more quickly. So I suppose, for me, it's all about balance. A lot of the challenges that we have are still there, whether we're Brexit in or Brexit out. I think for me, it's about timing, and it's about those people within that development cycle coming through and delivering quickly. So it's when they get their money out quickly. So there has to be opportunities. I have to stay positive because I think that that's a really, really important thing is, do we need to push hard to make things, build things through? I think we also need to recognise that many of those problems that we've got stay, regardless of how the legislative framework works, and we've got to work through those. Okay.
I'm Hywel Davies. I'm Technical Director at CIBSE, so apologies to the CIBSE members who've had to put up with my photograph in the journal for the last nearly 10 years while I've been doing that job. And before that, I was involved in CIBSE for about 9 years as part-time doing research management. And the other part of my time I used to spend working for a number of industry bodies, the Construction Clients Forum in that time, working on standards and even, dare I say, I will own up to having been one of the people who tried to advise the civil servants advising ministers on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Of course, it's ultimately ministers who take all the decisions. That's my polite way of saying, don't blame me. Before that, I spent a number of years working at the Building Research Establishment, largely in the days when it was a public sector, effectively national lab. I spent some time working on policy jobs, again, advising civil servants, advising ministers. I had 3 very interesting years coordinating all the work that was done by the BRE on standards in Europe. And that was in the period 1992 to 95, when a lot of the initial work on the single European market was being done. Something called the Construction Products Directive was new and shiny, and it was all going to be up and running by 1992. Don't ask me when it arrived. It was even slower than a Southern Region train. And before that, I had a long interest in politics, which I think probably goes back to being dragged out canvassing in at least one of the 1974 elections, because we had 2 that year. For those who are appalled by the result of elections in a recent country on the other side of the Atlantic, I can remember when Ronald Reagan was elected, and very few people saw that one coming either. Talking of Americans, I do rather like the Donald Rumsfeld triage. There are the known knowns, there are the known unknowns, and there are the unknown unknowns. And I'm going to try and identify a few of the known knowns and a few known unknowns. But not even I am going to try and do the unknown unknowns. I was somewhat embarrassed the other day at the City Conference. We had Max Fordham, who is celebrating 50 years of Max Fordham partnership. And he was the keynote speaker in the morning. And I was down to do something on the implications of leaving the EU in the afternoon. And Max, at one point in answer to a question, said, well, of course, anybody who tries to predict the implications of the UK leaving the EU has to be mad. So with Max Fordham's endorsement ringing in my ears, I think there are a few things we can be pretty clear on. We voted to leave the EU. We haven't voted to leave the European Standards Body, CEN. There is a wrinkle there, but in principle, we intend to stay, and they have indicated that they want us to stay, possibly because we pay 10% of the budget, but that's another story. We haven't voted to leave the European Economic Area. Now, this one gets quite interesting. If you dig out something like the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and if you work in the MEP sector, I would encourage you to be aware of that original source document. But you will find, under the title, there's a little line that says text with EEA relevant. What does that mean? The very short answer is, any directive you find that has that on it will continue to be relevant to the UK if we remain in the European Economic Area. So the whole debate about do we stay in the single market is really sharp, because if we stay in the single market, the texts with EEA relevance, which covers a lot of directives and a few regulations, will apply. Now, of course, one of the pillars of the single market, apologies if you've got this already, is
that there are 4 key freedoms, one of which is freedom of movement. Movement of goods, movement of services, movement of people, movement of capital. And we all know where the debate's going on movement of people. So whether staying in the EEA is compatible with whatever secret wish list Mrs. May is writing in Downing Street at the moment, sorry, but actually I think that's an unknown at the moment. And it may not become entirely clear even in March. So what? Depending on what we do with the EEA has a huge impact on what happens to legislation. But there are some things that we don't have to wait to find out about the EEA and whether we stay in the single market. I don't think it's likely that there will be a change in the Climate Change Act. One of Mrs. May's chiefs of staff, she has joint chiefs of staff, one of them has called the Climate Change Act the biggest act of self-harm in human history. However, I'm not at all sure that there is the political will to scrap the Climate Change Act. And I think there are a number of reasons why that just isn't going to happen. So that means that the carbon dioxide emissions targets that are embedded in it are going to stay. And things like the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, things like the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme that comes in under the Energy Efficiency Directive, things like the commitments that we've signed up to as a result of the Paris conference, the so-called COP21, they all still apply, and there's no obvious indication that there is a will to do away with those. And that means there's limited scope to mess around with Part L of the building regulation, in spite of some calls that have appeared in the January press from certain quarters suggesting they should be abolished. There's no obvious argument for major change to the building regs, or even to the Building Act. So the things that are built into them, I don't think are likely to change in a hurry. So we're not going to see energy performance certificates going. That may disappoint some of you. I don't think we're going to see SAP going in the domestic market. We've got minimum energy efficiency standards coming, which are going to affect the property sector, because this is where you can't rent out an F or G rated building, be it a dwelling or a commercial building, without doing something about it, either improving it or finding a reason to get it exempted. And minimum energy efficiency standards, there have been commitments post-referendum to that policy. That policy requires energy performance certificates. They're actually written in to the primary legislation in the Energy Act. That's not a European piece of legislation. So there's stuff that's hardwired into UK domestic policy around energy that depends on some of the European stuff. And that is not going to get unravelled in a hurry. One area where I think there is considerable uncertainty is around some of the other environmental things. What will happen on habitat, wildlife impact assessments? I'm sorry, Joe, I don't know either. What will happen on waste? And there are some curious little quirks around when things that are being done in buildings to refurbish them fall foul of various European waste regulation. That one is going to need some looking at. I happen to think it would be a good thing if it got looked at, because some of it is a real barrier to doing common sense things, because it suddenly becomes very difficult to reuse parts of buildings. Whether it will get looked at, and whether if it is looked at, the outcome will be sensible, I'm sorry, that's another unknown. Finishing off, one or two other things that won't change. European standards won't change. So the products we buy in as part of the 64% will still be made to European standards. The products that we make that we want to sell into Europe will still have to comply with European standards. So, that That's important, and our continuing involvement in European standards will be important. I don't see Brexit changing the pace of digitisation, and BIM got the mention by Mark. There are some extremely scary thoughts about where digitisation could take the construction sector. As a quick example, 40 years ago, the automotive industry employed roughly 10 times as many people as it does now. It produced roughly the same number of cars as it does now. If that happened to construction, employing, is it 7% or 14% if you include the self-employed? If you, and this is an example of decimation in the real sense, 1 in 10, you decimate the construction workforce and some politicians are going to have a problem because that's going to have an impact on employment and probably a fiscal impact as well, but I'll leave that to David. So digitisation, we've got to keep an eye on. It's nothing to do with Brexit, but it's going to be an impact. And then finally, the whole issue of refrigerants and F-gas. There's an F-gas regulation. That means it's written in Europe and it has direct effect in UK law. There is no UK legislation. So if we leave the EU and we leave the EEA, the F-gas regulation ceases to apply. What happens to that? There's pressure for alternative refrigerants. Many of them hydrocarbons that are flammable. Some of those hydrocarbons look suspiciously like the stuff you put into your gas cooker to cook dinner on. And they're highly regulated. So how's that all going to work? If we lose the F-gas regulation, that could create some problems. I hope that gives some food for thought. Somebody said there are 40,000 pieces of legislation affected, and that's just a handful of them.
Right. Thank you. I could invite the panellists to the front. And while they assemble, I'll try and summarise what we've just heard. Of course, I was seeking clarity in all of this, so we've got some. But let me just try and summarise. Mark is worried about the workforce, he's worried about inflation, but he does see some solutions out there. This is an opportunity to modernise, make things smarter. Interestingly, Mark suggested modular bits and pieces from China imported into the UK could be a solution, and maybe that's worth exploring. David spoke about the fact that he'd seen many varied outcomes as a result of Brexit. Things he highlighted, which directly affect the construction industry, include the collapse in sterling and the impact on inflation. He mentioned the growth, or perhaps the lack of growth, in the near future. But there was some good news in all of that, I think. David described the investment in infrastructure and particularly the benefits to this part of the world, which is good news. Joe spoke about the property sector and cycles, particularly the impact on London and the knock-on impact on the rest of the country. The good news, again linked to the sterling collapse, is the increased attractiveness to investors to this country. But also, at the same time, Joe described the fact that investors are concerned about what could happen in the future. I did take some good news from what Joe was saying. In fact, at one stage she said, no juice. Wouldn't that be fantastic? No juice. As somebody has to get involved in responding to juice, I think that's fantastic news. But then that was compensated by the fact there will be some other form of process we'll have to go through. Never mind. Finally, who mentioned the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. And the fact that we haven't voted to leave the EEA, which is a very, very valid point, and therefore the impact is, well, hopefully there will be no impact on the Climate Change Act and associated regulations and schemes. But then it concluded the fact that the risk of digitisation, which is probably subject of another talk, perhaps. So, look, that's my brief summary, but I'm sure you'll have lots of questions to ask. So, has anybody got any questions? Yes.
So I think in the lead up to Brexit and since, a lot of the main of our trade imbalance. Another thing that's been mentioned has been Indian investment, which might rise from Brexit. But looking the other way, I was wondering if you could from sector exporting our skills.
Yeah, if I take that first, I definitely think there are opportunities in the export without a shadow of a doubt. Obviously, there's a currency implication which works both ways, and obviously depends where we're looking. And I guess the other big issue is going to be around the level of regulation which is put in place in terms of whether that's going to act as a block, if that's going to stop. But otherwise, I think that's where the real opportunities definitely lie. If the opportunities aren't here through the infrastructure spend, which I think should come anyway, certainly there are major opportunities overseas, and potentially certainly within Europe, I would say there are definitely some real opportunities. The problem with which you're faced in the short term is there are some significant risks associated with Europe as well. Europe is somewhat behind us in the curve in terms of the monetary policy that was put in place and quantitative easing as it now emerges from recession. And as you'll be well aware, we've got a series of elections coming up now in Europe which could follow on the same sort of populist approach which we've seen coming from Brexit and then over in America. Those could act as massive destabilizing items through the course of this year. Germany, whilst it looks the most stable, is obviously the most pertinent, and that's coming up towards the end of this year. If, however, those don't fall over into becoming a real problem, the opportunities that would then exist would be, I would suggest, very significant. And provided those blocks aren't put in the place in way by regulation in terms of what needs to be in place there, I think there are definitely some opportunities. Just in the general context, I think broadening our horizons and looking away just from the obvious is the way we need to go. The world is changing, and simply putting the emphasis upon old relationships, upon old established trading establishments, is not the way we need to be. There are many more markets now where we should be looking to develop and try and identify where those opportunities lie. And certainly many of those smaller economies around the world are some of those which we should really be trying to tackle.
Mark, will you be looking to do more work abroad?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, our skills and expertise is in great demand, not nationally but internationally. And it's a fantastic opportunity to go out there and actually say, not only can we do it better, but we're actually cheaper as well. We're cheaper than we were nationally. So yeah, it's something we're looking quite hard at.
I mean, I think the thing that I would add is that on top of both, the other thing we've got to realise is the point about digitalisation in the way that actually we are just a global industry, and actually the ability to transact and work across continents is so fundamentally easier to do, and that is only going to change in the coming years. So I think those opportunities are going to be much greater as long as the legislation doesn't secure it.
The only thing I'd add, that those businesses that work outside of the Southwest but happen to have an office there, there's a big report by the World Economic Forum on construction which is well worth being aware of, because it identifies a number of opportunities and some significant challenges.
I better read that one. Yes.
But at the same time, I sort of imagine that population dying as well, or because there's a number of people and I just wanted to talk about whether it's a investment and to deal with this, what seems to be why it is that
Yes, I'd probably pick up on that. The week after the 23rd of June, I was doing a public slating, really, in a public meeting in Oxford, where I was told that I could go home and we didn't need to put 2,500 houses on an airfield because we were closing the doors and we weren't going to have this problem anymore. Absolute rubbish. The inherent problem about housing is something which is 15 years in our making. It will probably take 20 years to resolve, and it's nothing to do, or only a very small proportion of it, is to do with immigration into our country. We have to solve this problem. I think what's more interesting is the way that we solve it. And I take on board your point. You get more supply, therefore does demand. But I think it's the way people live. So actually, Mark touched upon it. The private rented sector is going to have a huge influence going forward. We're at the very start of that curve of how that impacts on the way that actually we deliver homes and how we deliver that supply. But I see no letter. I think like this is a time lag problem that we have to resolve. And it is a challenge because of the size of our country, the size of the population. That, to me, regardless of Brexit, is where the planning process has to change. And we all know that planning law changes every time the politicians haven't got anything to do. They always have a go at changing and reworking the planning process. A brave Prime Minister, in my opinion, would say, if we're going to deal with the housing crisis, let's, yes, invest money in it, but let's look at all of our green belts and let's reconsider where the growth needs to go and how we're going to accommodate it and change policy. But the problem is that time lag is created by the policy delays that we have. So I think for me, I don't think this is a Brexit problem. I think it's a problem that we have to resolve, and we need to resolve in an accelerated way.
Can I just sort of maybe expand that then to housing? I think I mentioned workforce. Well, maybe I missed it further, but expanding the question. So, in terms of the workforce within the construction industry, I think many of you mentioned the risk associated with that. What would be what advice would you give the government? Should, in terms of ensuring that we have the right skills available to deal with the large infrastructure investment in part of the world and nationally? You know, is there something they should be doing differently?
Well, I guess if I look at it from a general perspective, not just within the construction sector, I mean, I think the issue that you've got, clearly, migration from within the EU has been absolutely central to the success of the country, and it's added to the economy, as has been discussed before. And within the construction sector in particular, it's key to have those skilled workers. If we're not going to be able to bring in the workers that we require on that basis, then we're going to have to potentially look at how we can utilise the existing workforce better. So I would be encouraging any employer to be looking at how you can better train young people and recruit them into the industry, and then make sure they're appropriately trained to want to stay within the industry. I'd also look at the other end of the scale and actually potentially keeping people in work for longer, so they work to an older age within the industry as well. I think those are the ways you're going to have to look at it if you're not going to be able to bring in those sort of people across.
Yeah, and Peter, and just to expand on that, in the other market we're looking at outsourcing, using other areas, other countries to bring those skills in. Don't necessarily have to be located here. With all the technology we've got, we're fully able to actually work alongside people who are the other side of the world, and we're doing that at the moment. And as long as you set it up properly and you choose people with the right skills and the right knowledge, it works. That's some of the answers to some of our problems we have.
I just wonder if this will provide us with a challenge that might stimulate us to ask, how do we make the construction industry a more attractive place to work? I'm conscious that we're sponsored by the organisation on the banner behind me. There's an imbalance of men and women in construction, and I am sure that some of that is down to the attractiveness of the industry for some people to work in, its ability to accommodate people's needs. How good are we as an industry at retaining people? How many people join the industry and by 35, 40, they've had enough and they want to go somewhere else? They're things we can do something about. The one we really struggle with is that because of the fiscal issues, we are used as the emergency brake in the economy. So every now and again, whether we want to or not, the brake is slammed on. We lose a whole load of people because we can't employ them anymore. And they say, thank you very much, construction, I'm never coming back. And that one we do actually need to engage with politicians on somehow, I think. So how we can attract the right people and then retain them are things we do need to get our heads around.
That's a role for women in property and CIBSE.
It's a role for women in property, it's a role for CIBSE, it's a role for a number of professional bodies.
Actually, can I just step it? It's a role for every single person in this room. I think the one thing we all learned running up to the 23rd of June is actually we weren't vocal enough. If you were a Remaining, we weren't vocal enough in terms of what our views were on it. So I think it's a collective responsibility for us to get out there and sell our industry, and therefore then also go up the chain and say the very point you make. How do you retain the best people in this industry? And it's for us to not be silent about what is the right approach for retention. And certainly, in terms of GVA, I'm heading up a very big inclusion thing, and that's the message: is that lot. It's the drain between 30 and 40, not just of women, just of people going, I don't get this industry anymore. I started on it, I had a huge aspiration, but actually, there's somewhere else to go. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to change that cycle.
I would like to add a point. Actually, it was discussed about the European regulations and standards. I'm more worried about, I'm structural engineer, I'm more worried about how my work is going to change in 3 years living in the UK and working on the UK buildings. How sure are we that we're going to retain the European legislation, the code of standards, are going to design the buildings in the same way that we're designing them now, in terms of the design codes? Because I studied Eurocode at university, and then when I got my first job, my employer was from British Standard, so there was a big mess about how to design the buildings and which code we should use. How sure are we that we're going to design?
I guess that's one for me then.
You're on your own.
Yes. While you're thinking of your answers, that's a really good question. Eurocodes have been steadily coming in. They are now referred to in our building regs. They've caught up. If I tell you that it took about 40 years to write the complete set of Eurocode, so what? If we now want to wind the clock back, if we wanted to, and we'll ask whether that's a wise thing in a minute, if we wanted to, it would take at least as long as the Article 50 negotiations to recreate an up-to-date, fit-for-purpose set of British documents to replace the Eurocode suite. Bluntly, I cannot conceivably see that happen. There are people who worked for ARUPs, as they're hosting us tonight, who devoted decades of their working life. I'm thinking of a guy called Robin Whittle, who was involved in the structural Eurocodes for decades. There is no way on earth employers are going to agree to that level of person putting in the level of work that is needed to recreate the old style British standard system. It just isn't going to happen. So, well, I'm sorry, if somebody can give me a rational model where it will happen, and I know that because I've listened to the Director of Standards at BSI, and you can go and listen to his talk on the implications of Brexit for BSI is up on YouTube. There are a few things that I would quibble with, but the broad message, he's right. We have to stay in the single European standards model. We cannot, it would be lunacy to do otherwise. Because if we don't, anything we want to sell in Europe, be it goods or services, we will have to run a two-standard system. No investor in their right mind is going to tolerate that. So in terms of what it means for anybody in work, I think we will still work largely to British and European standards, or British, European and international, where all three have come together. We will continue, BSI are determined to stay in SEN, and SEN say they are prepared to change the statutes of SEN to keep BSI. And I am becoming old and cynical, and I do think there's a financial aspect to that, but I also think there is a realism that keeping Britain within a single European standard model is important. So, I think there are some really compelling arguments why you will not suddenly be starting to go back to BS 8110 for reinforced concrete design at any point in your career.
One of my favourites.
Yeah. We were talking about it before.
Okay.
That's enough, isn't it?
Thank you. Thanks for your question. We've got time for one or two other questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is from IES. One of the arguments made by the pro-Brexit group was that Britain, after having left the EU, would be able to renegotiate new terms and conditions with the Commonwealth.
Yep.
So as to, I'm guessing, getting the British economy running better. How do you see Britain, negotiating with the Commonwealth and the construction industry coming in? How do you see all that getting together?
That's a big question.
I should have said it's a broad question.
Yeah, so I'll get a broad answer. The answer to that, I think, is we know the negotiations are going to be very painful and very long and drawn out. There's all sorts of models which you've heard put out there in terms of the type of model of the type of trade deals we could put in place. I don't think any of the deals which have been put in place historically are the sort of deals that we are going to actually sign up to ultimately. This isn't about going backwards in many ways, if you like, back to the Commonwealth. This is a much wider global world with which we're now trading. We have to identify where those areas of growth are and where we want to best place those trade deals going forward. Mentioned before some of the other areas of the world where some of the greater opportunities now exist. It's about opening out those opportunities and trying to get the best trade deals we can in each area. But it is going to be very difficult. If you look at the Canadian model as being possibly one of the closest to where we would sit, it takes the best part of 10 years to get that deal put in place. We're dealing with, if we're talking about the EU countries, we've got 27, 28 countries to deal with on that basis now. And to try to get that deal in place is going to take a significant amount of time and effort. My real concern is that we've got the wrong people doing it at the moment. The people that we have in place, Theresa May's got very little experience of the EU trade. She was a Home Office minister, that's where her background is. And the whole department actually has very little experience of actually dealing with those trade negotiations. We've just seen the chief negotiator obviously step down, being replaced, but step down, and it just goes to indicate the extent of the problem we currently have because we haven't got the right team in place. Doesn't mean we can't get it right, and we're going to have a long time to do it, but for me it's about making sure that we identify where those opportunities are that are the right ones for us to be going for in the right way. The idea of the special relationship back to the States and why that's so important for us is backward looking. We don't need to do that. China, India, other areas of the world are going to become much more important players. And in many ways, that's where we need to be looking to now make those trade deals. So it's going to be a difficult process.
And with apologies to any American citizens in the audience, would you want a special relationship with Donald Trump? and how predictable is that going to be?
I don't know. Okay, well, yes. Any other? I've got one question. Yes. Yes, please. Thanks.
Where a lot of private funds being invested.
Yeah.
Post Brexit, have you seen a shift in terms of where the money is going into, and if so, what is that direction?
Within the property market, we're talking specifically?
Well, specifically, if you've got pension funds that were looking at property post Brexit, there now is there a hesitancy to that sector? That's where the implication will follow.
Okay, very quickly, as you will appreciate, the commercial property market obviously went through a particularly good period of about 3 years up to the beginning of 2016, tremendous run, double-digit return. Start of 2016, there obviously came the concern of the referendum coming up, and therefore there was a massive slowdown, because obviously, as you will know, all deals basically stopped, because companies were uncertain as to what they were going to be doing going forward. As a result of Brexit, there was a very immediate response. The immediate response from the pension funds and from the property funds was obviously to apply fair value adjustments to downgrade the valuations of the whole fund, and also in many cases to put in place a temporary suspension, because they were very worried there would be a significant outflow of money. What happened almost as immediately was there appeared buyers. Private equity firms within the UK realised there was a real opportunity to hoover up good properties here within And for overseas investors, as we talked about before, there was an even greater advantage because sovereigns overseas, like Kuwait, for example, could come in and buy properties in London at a massive discount, 20% currency adjustment, plus, say, a 10% valuation adjustment. So they were very quickly on the scene to hoover up anything which was going to be made available. That stopped the sale. So the market immediately recovered its poise, if you like, and stabilized. At the moment, I would suggest it's variable because at the moment they're very uncertain about the timing of the deal and exactly what that's going to mean. But there's a reassurance come back to the market that actually it's going to be sound whatever. It might not deliver the same returns it has done historically, but it's going to be solid. And in a world where we might be looking at a low yield coming through from commercial property, that's still damned attractive by comparison to bond yield or cash. So there's still very much a very solid place for it, I would suggest. Within that, I would say many investors, however, back to the point we made before, aren't just looking UK. They're looking slightly more diverse within the UK, and they're looking overseas, particularly back, we said before, to Europe. But within the UK, there's a new type of property fund developing as well, a build to let, effectively, within the institutional fund. An area I would focus on, if I were in the construction sector, in many ways, looking at the property investment market, would be to those things which have a degree of indexation, inflation protection within the rental income, with very long-term lets, and that's things around, housing, around accommodation projects, universities, for example, where you've got government backing, where you therefore know you're going to get the rental income over a very long period. So I think we just need to change our thinking in terms of where those opportunities might exist, both within the UK and potentially also overseas.
Great. Has anybody got any more burning questions? The panelists, or most of the panelists, will be upstairs. I can take questions. So, yes, one more, then we'll
very quick one, David. The interest rate finally rising since economic situation.
Okay, quick one. The answer is that the Bank of England cut interest rates immediately post-Brexit from 0.5% to 4%. I think that was a sensible move. Actually, it does nothing because there's no company out there that's going to start borrowing at 0.25% that wasn't borrowing at 0.5%. So it does nothing, but it sent a signal to the market, which is a degree of reassurance. So that was positive. At the same time, what they also did was further quantitative easing, and that I don't think was positive. It doesn't actually get back out into the market at all, and it creates various problems in the background as well, which we won't go into. But as a consequence of that, the pressure has now come to move rates upward. We've seen a very sharp move in interest rates in the States starting to apply now. We've seen bond yields kick up very sharply. It will follow through in terms of interest rates. The Fed raised rates for the second time again in December. They've got 3 potential rises coming through during the course of this year now, I would suggest. I think we're still going to have to wait for a little while before we see the first one in the UK, because Mark Carney and the Bank of England are quite keen to let inflation shoot above target before they do anything. They won't adjust straight away. And I personally think it will be towards the latter end of 2017, probably into 2018, before we see the first move. But after that, we're likely to see them move more sharply than they would otherwise have done. We're going to have to cope with what is significantly rising inflation. That's probably the biggest economic problem that the market is currently facing at the present time. The only way to deal with it is to push rates up.
Great. Look, I think it's call time on it now. Look, thank you very much. The sheer number of people we've got here is obviously there's a tremendous interest in this particular subject. So thank you very much for coming on. Thanks very much for the questions. They were brilliant. I'd like to thank the panelists in the usual way. So thank you very much.
Hockey. I thought you were playing.